2 minutes after takeoff on Thursday, January 15th, 2009, U.S. Airways Flight 1539 struck a flock of Canadian geese and damaged 2 engines. The pilot was Captain Sully Sullenberger. His co-pilot and he had to instantly make the right decisions if they were going to save the lives of their passengers and the people on the ground. And they quickly considered 2 local airports, but decided they didn't have the speed to make it. They considered landing on the highway, but they knew the danger was too great to pedestrians and to their passengers. They only had one option, the Hudson River. A water landing was the only option, despite the fact that one error could result in the plane hitting the water, flipping, and the plane rolling. In his book, After You Believe, N.T. Wright described what had to be done in the plane, and he says it better than I ever could, so I'll just read it. In the 2 or 3 minutes that they had before landing, Sullenberger and his co-pilot had to do the following things. They had to shut down the engines. They had to set the right speed so that the plane could glide as long as possible without power. Fortunately, Sullenberger was also a gliding instructor. They had to get the nose of the plane down to maintain speed. They had to disconnect the autopilot system, override the flight management system. They had to activate the ditch system so that all the vents and every hole would be sealed so that the plane would be as waterproof as possible. Most important, they had to fly and then glide the plane in a fast left-hand turn so that it would come down facing south so it would go with the flow of the river. And having turned off the engines, they had to do all of this using only the battery-operated systems and the emergency generator. Then they had to straighten the plane up from the tilt of the sharp left turn so that on landing it would be exactly level from side to side. Finally, they had to get the nose back up again, but not too far up, so that they could land straight and flat on the water. 2 minutes. I'm sure we've all heard the story of that day, and we know that despite the odds against them, every passenger survived the landing. The plane floated long enough for everyone to get off safely. And we don't hear accounts like that very often. In fact, many people described it as a miracle. I think Jesus used a different word, and in a moment I'll tell you that word. But what does Flight 1549 have to do with our gospel reading? And what does any of this have to do with Christmas? Am I right? Well, this isn't Christmas. This is Advent. Despite what you see in Lowe's or Walmart or the grocery store or the radio station, this is Advent. Everyone say that with me. This is Advent. This is Advent. And Advent is about getting ready. Unfortunately, what Advent usually means for us is the time when we ignore Christmas, at least at church. Secretly at home, we put up all the decorations. This is when we all become evangelical and we show up to church pretending we didn't do something that weekend, right? Well, this year we're going to work on celebrating Advent. Not just ignoring Christmas, but celebrating this festive season that we're in. I can't think of a better scripture to begin with this time of contemplation, celebration, preparation than this scripture, and I can't think of a better story than the story of Flight 1549. When we hear this verse typically, we hear it, and preachers are using it to tell us about the end of the world. We hear this and we think Judgment Day. We hear this and words like rapture come to our mind, especially if you were a kid and you saw that movie. Do you remember that movie that kept you up late at night, worried you were going to walk into your house and everyone was going to be gone and you were the only one left? Preachers dig through this part of Matthew, trying to find clues about the end of the world. They make lots of money then writing books about those clues, and they put lots of butts in the seats in seminars talking about how you can get ready for the end of the world. And it's good business, it's bad theology. They do all of this ignoring what Jesus said. Did you know Jesus said this? About that exact day or hour, no one knows, not even heaven's angels, not even the Son, only the Father. Did you hear that? Nobody knows. Nobody. Let's say it one more time. I'm going to read the verse again. About that exact day and hour, no one knows, not even heaven's angels, not even the Son, only God knows. So anyone who tells you they know must be God the Father. Because that is the only one who knows. Not even Jesus knows. The angels don't know. Nobody knows. If someone heard this gospel in our time, and they had the word rapture in their mind, or they heard the end of the world as they read it, they would hear the phrase John read for us, 2 will be working in the field, 1 will be taken, and the other left. And they would think, oh, I hope I will be taken. I don't want to be left behind. But the people who first heard Matthew's gospel read, the people who first heard Jesus preach, wouldn't have thought about the end of the world, especially the way we think about it. They would have known that all through their scriptures in Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Isaiah, whenever you see the phrase, the day of the Lord, it meant armies are coming to destroy Jerusalem. It meant Nebuchadnezzar is showing up with the armies of Babylon. It meant the chickens are coming home to roost. And a person wanted to get left behind. You wanted to be left behind. The last thing you wanted was to be carried off as a slave in a strange land. Being left behind was a good thing. In the context of our gospel reading, Jesus had just told his disciples the temple was going to be destroyed, and it was. In the year AD 70, Rome marched their armies into Jerusalem and leveled the city and the temple. It was, from their perspective, the day of the Lord. Here's the point. Regardless of all of that, here is the point. Be ready. Be ready. Be ready when the things that are overwhelmingly bad, beyond imagination, happen. And I hate to use that word ready because you can't really be ready for those moments. So there's another word we should use. Jesus uses the analogy of a homeowner who, if she had known when the thief was coming, she would have been there to stop the break-in. Jesus is saying we need to be watchful like that woman. And I'm not saying that we need to stock our garages with 400 MREs and 5-gallon tanks of water, because that's another thing these first century Jewish folks would not have been able to do when they heard this verse. And they would have thought, far be it from me to hoard food and my neighbors get hungry. Jesus is saying we need to be ready in the way Captain Sully Sullenberger was ready. And that's truly the only way we can be ready for those unimaginable bad times. Jesus said we need to be watchful. And this word watchful in the Greek has as much to say about the character of the person watching as it does about being awake. And we have two words that are good to describe this idea of watchful. They're old words. We don't hear them very much anymore, but they are virtue and character. Virtue and character. You see, January 15th, 2009 was the day of the Lord for the passengers of U.S. Airways Flight 1549. Or at least it would have been that, were not one man watchful. You see, virtue in the ancient sense of the word is what happens inside of me and you when 1,000 small choices have been made. And every time we made them, it took a little effort and a little concentration. And it didn't just come exactly naturally in the moment. And then on the 1,001st time, when we had to make that decision again, and it really mattered, it looked easy. It looked natural. It looked effortless. It looked simple. Virtue happens when wise and courageous choices become second nature. I've been trying to think of a good example of what I mean, and this is the best one I came up with. I wake up early in the morning, and let's say I see the neighbors out on the front porch, and they say, "Hey, come over for donuts and coffee. Let's gossip on the front porch." There's some value in that, good gossip, right? And I think, well, I could do that, or I could eat a bowl of oatmeal, drink some water, and say morning prayer. It's not a big deal. Not a big difference. But when you make that choice 1,000 times, it can become a big deal. We know that Captain Sully Sullenberger, even though he was a year away from retirement, practiced every day on what he was supposed to do in an emergency situation. Do you know anyone like that? They kind of drive you crazy with their preparedness. I'm thinking of a certain organist I know who's been playing the organ for 67 years, however long, and yet 4 days a week he's here practicing. It takes practice to decide, I'm not going to be afraid of people. It takes practice to decide, I'm going to love people. It takes practice to love your neighbor as yourself. And it doesn't happen courageously. It happens when we make those 1,000 small choices. This is what Jesus means when he tells us to be wise. And that's what we're doing this Advent. We're ready for the celebration of the coming of Christ in the world. We're watchful for when Christ will come again. And the promise and the warning of God's future we consider at Advent is not meant to make us feel helpless or complacent or afraid, but to give us energy to work like it is the daytime.